The unexpected encounter. The cold wind howled through the barren landscape, the snow swirling in frenzied gusts as if trying to swallow the world whole. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark shadows against the gray sky, and the ground beneath was a frozen wasteland. The man, a seasoned traveler, trudged through the snow, his breath visible in the freezing air. His journey had taken him far from the familiar warmth of civilization, but there was a thrill in the solitude, a quiet solace in the harshness of nature. But tonight something felt different. As he moved forward, he spotted a faint silhouette against the white expanse. It was barely visible, hunched over and struggling in the snow. His instincts told him to keep moving, but he couldn't ignore the voice in his head urging him to check. He approached cautiously, the crunch of his boots barely audible against the howling wind. The figure ahead was small, barely moving, and its shape was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The closer he got, the more he realized that it wasn't human. Lying there in the deep snow was a girl, a young woman, her skin pale, almost shimmering with an unnatural glow under the snow. Her breathing was shallow, her body curled into a ball to preserve warmth, her clothes shredded and torn. He knelt beside her, assessing the situation. She was in bad shape, frozen to the core, barely conscious. He needed to act fast. There were no towns or shelters nearby, and the storm was only growing worse. He pulled off his coat, wrapping it around her fragile form, feeling the cold seep through his gloves as he lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light for someone who looked like they should weigh more. With determination, he started the long trek back to his small cabin, located further up the mountain. The snow was falling in thick sheets now, making every step more difficult than the last. But his instincts told him that if he didn't get her warm soon, she might not survive. As he stumbled into the cabin, the warmth hit him like a wave. He set the girl gently on the couch, removing the coat and trying to warm her frozen limbs. The storm raged outside, but within these walls, there was a sense of temporary safety. He hurried to gather blankets, piling them on top of her as he built a fire in the small hearth. She stirred, her eyes flickering open for a brief moment. Her gaze was wild and frightened, and she winced as she tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Who?" she started, but her words were lost in the cold air, a shiver racking her body. "It's okay. You're safe now," he reassured her, his voice low and soothing. "Just relax." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he thought he saw something unfamiliar in them. A strange, distant intelligence, a deep sadness that shouldn't belong to someone so young. She tried to speak again, her voice a little clearer this time. You should not have helped me." His brow furrowed, confused by her words. "What do you mean? You were freezing, unconscious. I couldn't just leave you out there." She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling erratically. "My kind, we are not meant to stay here. This place, it's dangerous for us. You should leave before it's too late." The man frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Dangerous? What are you talking about?" She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to say something important. "I am not from this world." At first he thought she was delirious from the cold. But as he looked down at her, he saw something in her eyes that made him pause. Something that made him question everything. Something that told him her words weren't the ramblings of a sick woman, they were the truth. The fire crackled behind him, the warmth filling the room, but the chill that ran down his spine was unmistakable. This marks the beginning of the journey. The unexpected encounter of a human helping an alien girl sets the stage for an incredible revelation. A stranger in the cold. The warmth of the cabin contrasted sharply with the bitter cold outside, but inside, there was a strange tension that neither the fire nor the blankets could melt. The girl lay there, her breathing steadier now, though still shallow, her skin tinged with an unnatural glow in the firelight. The man, whose name was Thomas, watched her carefully from the chair across the room, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up here, so far from civilization, in the middle of a snowstorm? And why had she warned him to leave? Her words echoed in his head, a warning he couldn't shake. "I am not from this world," she had said. Her voice was soft, but there was a weight to it, an earnestness that made him believe it. No, he thought there was something different about her. He had seen many things in his life, his time in the military, his travels, but nothing like this. Her eyes were too knowing, too ancient for someone so young, and her skin, he couldn't place it, but it wasn't like anything he'd seen before. Thomas stood up, moving slowly toward her as she slept. Her face, though pale, held an ethereal beauty, one that seemed almost unreal. He resisted the urge to reach out and touch her skin. What if she was dangerous? He shook his head. She was injured, vulnerable, How could he think she was dangerous? The fire crackled behind him, the only sound in the room. He grabbed a small metal kettle from the shelf and filled it with water, deciding to make tea. As he set it to heat on the stove, he glanced back at her. She had stirred in her sleep, her delicate features contorting slightly as if in pain. "Hey," Thomas called softly, but she didn't respond. He knew better than to startle someone from their sleep, especially someone as fragile as she appeared. He let the water heat, turning his attention back to the room. Outside, the storm still raged, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. He sat back down, feeling the weight of the silence pressing on him. The girl had been unconscious for hours, but now that she was awake, he had more questions than answers. He needed to know what she meant by "not from this world." The thought of aliens seemed absurd, a concept better suited for science fiction novels than reality. But when he looked at her, at the strange glow in her skin, her unique eyes, he couldn't help but wonder. The kettle whistled, cutting through his thoughts. Thomas grabbed it, carefully pouring the hot water into a mug and adding a bit of tea. He crossed the room and set the mug on the small table beside the girl, hoping the warmth might help her recover faster. As he reached for a blanket to adjust it over her, she suddenly opened her eyes. Her gaze was sharp, her pupils dilated with intensity. She looked directly at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the cold, yet carrying a tone that seemed to pierce through him. "Why did you save me?" Thomas hesitated, unsure how to answer. The gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. "I'm just a guy trying to make it through the winter," he said, sitting down at the edge of the table. "You were freezing outside. I couldn't leave you there." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face as though searching for something. Finally she nodded, her lips curling slightly, though there was no joy in the gesture. "You're kind," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You have a strange way of showing compassion." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his curiosity piqued. The girl slowly pushed herself upright, wincing slightly as she moved. She seemed weak but determined. "Humans have a habit of underestimating themselves. You think you're just ordinary, but you aren't. Not in the ways that matter." Her voice was steady now, though there was an edge to it. "Your kindness, it's not a mistake. It's something else?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I don't follow." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "There is something about you. Something about your species that sets you apart from others. It's why I'm here." "What do you mean, here?" Thomas pressed, leaning forward slightly, a knot tightening in his chest. This was far beyond anything he had imagined. Was she suggesting that humans had some sort of, what? Power? Special purpose? Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. She was struggling to find the right ones, or perhaps she wasn't sure she could trust him yet. "I didn't choose Earth," she said finally, almost as if confessing something. "I was sent here. By them." "Them?" Thomas repeated, a cold shiver running through his spine. "Who?" She closed her eyes for a moment, her body trembling as if recalling a painful memory. "The others, my people. They are not the same as yours. They came long before you. Long before even your ancient civilizations." She paused, her expression darkening. "And they are watching you?" Thomas's heart raced as he struggled to process her words. She wasn't just an injured girl. She was part of something far greater, a story that stretched across galaxies, a cosmic web of power and history. But why Earth? And why him? "I don't understand," Thomas whispered, his voice shaky. The girl met his eyes again, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "You will. Soon enough. But first, I need to rest. And you need to prepare for what comes next." Thomas wasn't sure what he was preparing for, but he knew one thing for sure. His life, his entire world, was about to change. This part deepens the mystery and begins to unravel the first thread of the girl's origins and the strange power that humans might possess. It raises more questions, pushing the story forward as the protagonist tries to understand what he has gotten himself into. Whispers of the past and the coming storm. Thomas woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside. It was the kind of storm that made you question the sanity of anyone who dared to be out in it. But here he was, stuck in a remote cabin with a mysterious alien girl who had just revealed far more than he was ready to process. He looked over at the girl who was still sleeping soundly. She was lying on the cot, her long silvery hair tangled around her, and her pale skin now radiated a faint glow. He couldn't stop staring at her. There was something mesmerizing about her, something that made his heart race with both awe and fear. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was in over his head. Prepare for what comes next. Her words from last night kept echoing in his mind. But what did she mean? What was coming next? Thomas stood up and walked toward the window. The storm outside hadn't let up, and there was no sign of it abating anytime soon. His thoughts were consumed with the girl's cryptic statements. My people, she had said. What did that mean? And why had they sent her here? Why him? He turned back to look at her again, trying to piece together what he knew. She had warned him, yet she hadn't seemed like a threat. She was weak, vulnerable even. But the fear in her eyes, when she'd spoken of them, of her people, that fear wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. It was deep, primal, as if she knew something terrible was coming. Her voice stirred him from his thoughts. You need to leave. He jumped slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl had woken up, and this time, there was no confusion in her voice. It was clear and forceful. I'm sorry, what? Thomas asked, incredulous. You need to leave. Now. Her voice was urgent but still weak, a contrast to the intensity in her eyes. I'm not leaving you out there, Thomas protested, shaking his head. You're in no condition to be out there. You'll freeze. Her gaze sharpened, and she pushed herself into a sitting position. She winced slightly, but there was determination in her eyes. I'm not worried about the cold. She took a breath before continuing, but they are coming. The storm is a sign. It's not just the weather. They know I'm here. Thomas took a step closer, his mind racing. Who knows you're here? Who are you talking about? She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw tears at the corners of her eyes, though they didn't fall. My people. They've been searching for me. You don't understand. The storm is just the beginning. They'll be here soon. The urgency in her voice made his stomach twist. Who are they? What do they want with you? They want control. They want power, she said, her voice trembling slightly. And they will do anything to get it? Thomas could see that she was growing weaker again, her energy waning. He moved toward her, intending to offer her comfort, but she pulled away. Do not touch me, she hissed, her voice harsh. You don't understand what you're dealing with. You're not ready for this. Her words stung, but there was a truth in them. He wasn't ready. He didn't know how to handle this situation, and he certainly didn't understand why an alien girl, who looked so fragile, was warning him of something so dangerous. I don't care what's coming, Thomas said, his voice steady now. I'm not leaving you out there, not after what happened last night. I'll protect you. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You don't know what you're dealing with. The storm is nothing compared to them. Thomas's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just let her go. Then tell me. Tell me what's going to happen. Her eyes softened, almost as though she saw a flicker of understanding in his gaze. The ones I escaped from, my people, they're not like you. They've conquered worlds, civilizations. They've destroyed countless species to claim what they want. I am their failure. She paused, her voice bitter. And now they'll make an example of me. Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. You said they're coming. How soon? Her eyes flickered to the window, and for a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw a glint of something unnatural in her gaze. The storm will end soon. When it does, they will be here. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. There was no way he could let her face whatever these people were. He didn't care if she was an alien, he couldn't just leave her to the wolves. Then we need to leave, he said firmly. We need to get out of here. She shook her head weakly, her face pale. You don't understand. I can't run from them. They will find me wherever I go. They have ways you can't even imagine. Thomas clenched his fists, his thoughts spinning. He had no answers, only instincts telling him to protect her. Then we fight, he said. We fight them. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps a glimmer of hope or something deeper, something more painful. You really are different, aren't you? I'm human, he said simply. And I won't let anyone harm you. She didn't reply immediately, but when she did, her voice was softer. You don't know what they are capable of. If you stay, you will be putting yourself in danger. You have no idea what they can do. I'll take my chances, Thomas said, his tone resolute. For a long time there was silence between them. Finally she spoke, her voice heavy with resignation. Then prepare yourself, human. The storm is just the beginning. When it clears, they will come for us both. As she spoke, Thomas felt the weight of her words settle over him. The cabin, once a simple refuge from the storm, now felt like the calm before the storm itself. What had started as a compassionate gesture, one simple decision to help someone in need, had led to something far beyond his comprehension. But now there was no turning back. The calm before the storm. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, howling with an intensity that rattled the walls of the cabin. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted since the moment he'd decided to shelter the alien girl. She wasn't just an innocent victim of a storm anymore. She was someone caught in the crossfire of something far bigger than anything he had ever known. The weight of the responsibility on his shoulders felt almost unbearable, but he wouldn't turn his back on her. He couldn't. He glanced over at her. She was sitting on the cot now, her eyes closed in concentration as if she were listening to something beyond the storm. Her presence in the cabin had become unsettling, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. She wasn't just an alien. She was a refugee, a target, and if what she said was true, she had brought something far more dangerous than a storm with her. "Why did you come here?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking the silence. "What is it that you're running from?" Her eyes fluttered open and she looked at him with a piercing gaze, as if weighing whether or not to share more. "You wouldn't understand," she murmured, her voice low and tired. "I understand more than you think," Thomas said, his voice firm. "You don't have to keep hiding from me. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment she didn't respond, but the tension in her posture seemed to ease slightly. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I was sent to find a place, any place, where I could escape them. I thought I could make it on my own, but they have ways of tracking me. The storm is their doing. They manipulate the weather to mask their arrival." Thomas was taken aback. "They control the weather?" She nodded. "Not directly, but they have technology far beyond anything you've ever seen. They can influence the environment to cover their tracks, to make sure no one knows they're coming. And they use it to hunt me? Why? What do they want from you?" Her eyes flashed with a mixture of sadness and anger. "I am their failure. I was supposed to be their weapon, an instrument of destruction, but I broke free. I betrayed them. And now they're going to make an example of me. They want to make sure no one ever dares to challenge them again." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of her words was heavy, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of defiance, that made him believe she hadn't given up. She was still fighting, even if she had no idea how to escape the hell that was closing in around her. "Is there anyone else who can help? Someone who knows how to stop them?" Thomas asked, his mind racing. "I can't let them do this to you." "I won't." She shook her head slowly. "No one can stop them. They have crushed entire civilizations. You are not equipped to fight them. No one is." "Then we run," Thomas said firmly. "We leave before they get here." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You don't understand. They'll find me no matter where I go. There's nowhere I can run to that they can't reach." Thomas clenched his jaw, his mind churning. "Then we fight them together. I don't care if they're aliens or gods or whatever they are. I won't let them take you." Her eyes softened for a moment, but the sadness in them deepened. "You are brave, human. But you have no idea what you're up against." He wasn't afraid. No matter how much he didn't understand, no matter how alien the threat was, he wasn't going to back down. "I've faced down dangers before. I'll face this one too." For the first time she seemed to consider it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, as if making a decision, she spoke again. "You're different. I can feel it. Most humans would run, or worse, they would betray me. But you're standing here, offering your life to protect mine. That's something rare, human." Thomas felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of pride at her words. But it was fleeting. The storm outside, the relentless howling of the wind, brought him back to the harsh reality of their situation. "We need to prepare," she said quietly, standing up with some difficulty. "They're coming. We need to be ready." Thomas nodded and moved to the window. He peered outside, though all he could see was the swirling white of the storm, its ferocity growing by the second. It felt like the world was closing in on them. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "But tell me what we need to do." She looked at him, her face serious. "We need to hide. They will come in the form of humans at first. They'll try to blend in, pretending to be like you, but they're not. They'll have masks to hide their true forms. The moment they step into this cabin, you'll know who they are. They're predators, and you'll feel it in your gut." Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Predators? What kind of predators? Should I fight them?" he asked, his voice shaky now. Her eyes darkened. "No. You'll only provoke them. They're too powerful. The best thing you can do is hide." She glanced at the far corner of the cabin, where a small storage area was hidden behind a curtain. "There's a place beneath the floorboards where you can hide. You'll need to use it if they come. If you stay here, you'll be putting both of us at risk." Thomas's heart sank. "But I'm not leaving you." I can't risk them finding both of us. You need to be prepared to run." As she spoke, there was a sudden sharp knock at the door. The predator's approach. The knock was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the storm. But to Thomas it was deafening. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as his mind raced. The sound wasn't normal, not in the middle of a blizzard, not in the remote area they were in. This was it. They had found them. The alien girl, no, she wasn't just an alien, she was his ally now, seemed to sense his panic before he could even voice it. She moved with a calmness that belied the danger, crossing the small cabin to the door in a few swift steps. Her movements were graceful, yet filled with a certain tension, like a predator who had learned to mask her own instincts. "Hide," she said, her voice low but firm, filled with authority that Thomas couldn't argue with. He didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the small hidden compartment beneath the floorboard she had mentioned earlier. There, in the darkness, he crouched, the smell of old wood and dust filling his nostrils as he silently closed the hatch above him. He stayed perfectly still, his ears straining to hear any noise from the outside world. His heart pounded as every second felt like an eternity. It was a long while before he heard any movement from the girl. The door creaked slightly as it opened, followed by the sound of the cold wind slicing into the cabin. He could just make out a few muffled voices through the thin floorboards, but they were strange, mechanical in their cadence, as if they didn't belong. The girl spoke now, her tone deceptively calm. "What do you want?" she asked, and Thomas could hear a faint echo of her alien accent, rougher and colder than a human's. She was trying to mask her fear. A voice responded, low and smooth but laced with an unmistakable threat. "We're looking for someone. A fugitive who stole something very valuable from us. We believe she's hiding here." Thomas's stomach twisted with dread. He had heard enough stories, seen enough films, to know that a group like this meant trouble. But the voice had said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, that it struck him harder than he could have imagined. They weren't just looking for the girl. They were hunting her like prey. The girl took a deep breath. "I am not the one you seek," she replied coolly, her voice masking the panic that Thomas knew must be threatening to break through. She was playing her part, but Thomas knew the truth. The storm outside, the unnatural stillness in her voice, were all signs that she was preparing for something far more dangerous than he could comprehend. "We know you are," another voice responded, now closer, just outside the cabin. "Step aside and we will leave you in peace. No one needs to get hurt." It was the voice of a man, but Thomas could hear the underlying hum, the mechanical rasp. Whatever they weren't human, not entirely. He clenched his fists in the dark, trying to hold back the surge of anger. He had to stay quiet, stay hidden. For now he had no choice but to wait. The girl had warned him. Fighting them would only get them both killed. The tension in the cabin thickened. The girl was silent for a moment, weighing her options. "I won't let you take me," she said suddenly, her voice now tinged with an icy resolve. The doors banged open with an explosive force. Thomas's heart stopped. It sounded like they had no intention of leaving quietly. And then, like a clap of thunder, the sound of a struggle erupted. The girl wasn't going down without a fight. From his hiding place, Thomas could hear the rapid footfalls, the scuffling and the sharp hiss of a weapon being drawn. The low hum of alien technology vibrated through the floorboards, setting his nerves on edge. The voice of the man, if it even was a man, came again, this time tinged with frustration. "You've made a mistake. You've crossed the line, girl. I told you," she hissed back, "I will never go back to you." The struggle intensified, the cabin filling with the sounds of a violent encounter. Thomas's hands gripped the sides of the compartment, his pulse hammering in his ears. He knew he couldn't wait much longer. His heart told him to stay hidden, to remain safe, but his conscience screamed at him to act. To help her. His options were limited, but there was one thing he could do. The floor creaked above as one of the aliens moved past the hiding spot. It was a split-second decision. Without thinking, Thomas reached for the knife he'd kept hidden in his jacket, gripping it tightly in his hand. He had no real plan, but he couldn't just let her face this alone. A loud crash erupted above, followed by a deep, guttural growl that sent a chill up his spine. It sounded like the girl had done something to break free. Maybe she had gotten a weapon, or maybe she had used her abilities to manipulate her captors. Now or never. He pushed the hatch open and leapt out of his hiding spot. The cabin was a mess of broken furniture, shattered glass, and debris. The girl was facing off against one of the alien attackers, her hands crackling with energy, but she was clearly exhausted. Sweat beaded on her brow, and her alien features showed the strain of the fight. Thomas didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, his knife raised high, and plunged it into the alien's side. The creature screeched, a hideous, inhuman sound that echoed through the cabin. It turned, its glowing eyes flashing red in fury. For a moment Thomas thought he was done for, but the girl leapt forward in one swift motion, delivering a crushing blow to the alien's throat. The creature fell to the floor with a sickening thud. But their victory was short-lived. From the other side of the cabin, more shadows emerged. At least 3 more aliens, each towering over them, their eyes glowing with menace. Thomas could feel his breath catch in his chest, but he stood his ground. There was no going back now. They had to face this no matter the cost. The final stand. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a death trap. The air was thick with the pungent smell of alien technology, of desperation, and of the freezing storm outside. Each breath Thomas took seemed heavier, as if the very walls were closing in around him. The girl, his only ally in this fight, stood beside him, her eyes sharp and focused, her alien features alight with intensity. They were vastly outnumbered. The 3 remaining aliens were tall, their frames broad and menacing. Their eyes glowed red with malevolent power, and their armor shimmered under the dim light of the flickering lantern. Their weapons, sleek and deadly, hummed with the promise of destruction. Thomas could feel his pulse quicken, but he knew that backing down wasn't an option. Not anymore. "Stay behind me," the girl whispered to him, her voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. "This fight is mine. You don't have to die here." But Thomas didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the alien warriors, his hands clenched around the knife that felt too small for what lay ahead. There was a fire in him now, a surge of determination. He had seen what these creatures were capable of, but more than that, he had seen the kindness in the girl's eyes. He wasn't going to let her fall without a fight. "No," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere. We fight this together." The girl's eyes softened, just for a moment, but then she steeled herself again, her stance shifting into one of readiness. "Very well," she said, her tone hardening once more. "Then stand close, human. It will be our only chance." The 3 aliens advanced, their movements swift and precise. One of them, the leader perhaps, spoke in a low, guttural language that Thomas couldn't understand, but the threat was clear in his voice. The other 2 spread out, flanking them, each taking positions that would limit their escape. They had cornered them. But the girl didn't flinch. Instead she moved first. With a speed that left Thomas breathless, she launched herself at the closest alien, her body a blur of motion. She twisted in midair, her feet connecting with the alien's chest with a bone-shattering impact. The alien staggered back, its armor cracking under the force of her strike, but it quickly recovered, swiping its weapon at her in retaliation. The girl ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and retaliated with a vicious spin, sending a burst of energy from her palms that slammed into the alien's torso. The blast sent the creature sprawling backward, its body crashing into the wall, leaving a dent in the wooden planks. But before Thomas could even process the attack, one of the other aliens lunged at him. Its glowing eyes fixed on him with malicious intent, its weapon raised high. He barely had time to react as it swung at him with a sickening arc, but the girl was there, her hand grabbing his arm and pulling him back just in time. The alien's weapon sliced through the air where Thomas's neck had been, and the force of the swing left a trail of static energy crackling in the air. "Run," the girl commanded, but there was no time for retreat. The alien had recovered and was charging again, and the girl was already engaged in a brutal struggle with the other 2. She was fast, but there was only so much she could do against the sheer strength of the alien warriors. Thomas, heart pounding, made a decision in an instant. He couldn't just stand by. He rushed forward, ignoring the pounding of his heart in his chest, and drove the knife he held into the back of the alien charging toward him. The blade sunk deep into its armored hide, but it only slowed the alien momentarily. It turned, its face twisting in rage, but before it could retaliate, Thomas felt a sudden jolt of energy, a surge of power unlike anything he had ever known. The alien shrieked, its body convulsing as the energy from the girl collided with it. With a final scream, the alien collapsed, lifeless, onto the ground. The girl, panting and bloodied from the battle, stood beside him, her eyes wide in disbelief. You actually killed one of them?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. Thomas, still gripping the knife, stared at the fallen creature. His hands were shaking, but his resolve was unbroken. "I'm not letting you die here. Not after everything you've done." For a brief moment, the girl's expression softened. Something like respect, even admiration, flickered in her eyes. But there was no time for anything more. The remaining two aliens were closing in, and their time was running out. "We need to finish this now," the girl said, her voice sharp as she charged toward the remaining enemies. This time, her movements were faster, more lethal, and the energy she harnessed seemed to grow stronger, crackling in the air with a raw intensity. Thomas wasn't just watching anymore. He was fighting beside her, using every ounce of strength he had to help her take down the remaining warriors. They worked in sync, a team forged through fire. He threw himself into the fray, stabbing, dodging, and using every weapon at his disposal to keep the aliens at bay. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they stood victorious. The last alien crumpled to the floor with a final, gurgling gasp, and the cabin fell silent. Thomas and the girl stood there, panting, covered in bruises and blood, but alive. He wiped his brow, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe freely. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, his voice weak but filled with hope. The girl nodded, her expression softening as she surveyed the aftermath of their battle. "For now," she said. "But it will never truly be over, Thomas. Not for me. Not for us." Thomas stood beside her, feeling the weight of her words, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Against the cold, against the odds, they would survive. And maybe, just maybe, they would find something worth living for.